Those eyes. No, that could not be real. Jonathan Mercer froze at the corner of 3rd and Harbor as 4 women, shivering against the November wind, held out wool scarves and folded paper flowers with a precision he had only ever seen in the careful fingers of someone who loved making things to keep someone else warm. The smell of fried dough from a street cart mixed with the sharp tang of river air, and a bus brakes hissed like someone exhaling too loudly. For a moment, the crowd blurred into streaks of color and sound, while one face stepped forward from the cluster, a face that made his chest hollow out because it was the same profile he had traced in the dark for 10 years, the same tilt of the jaw, the same small scar at the left temple. He had left that life, built towers of glass and led a company that renamed skylines, but the look of her eyes unzipped time. If you were standing there, what would you do? Tell us in the comments what your first move would be. This was not a coincidence he could file away. It was an opening, a crack in a wall he had thought sealed. That paper flower, trembling between 2 fingers, was a key, and it would unlock the rooms he had locked inside himself. In public, Jonathan Mercer was exacting and composed. He wore bespoke suits, his hair combed just so, his name on buildings and philanthropic dinners. In the boardroom, his voice was even and persuasive, a voice that could calm a crisis or start a takeover. At home, in the years before the split, he had been different. A man who slept on the wrong side of the bed so as not to wake her, a man who learned to make coffee the way she liked it. He had been proud then, and afraid that pride could be cruel, the kind that shuts doors. There was a wound there, a decision he had made in haste and shame that had cost him a marriage and bought him control. People called him decisive. He called himself guilty. A memory cut across him like a gloved hand. The sight of those eyes came from a night he had slammed a door and told her to leave. For a decade, he had answered questions with spreadsheets and calendars. Now, a corner stall and 4 scarves asked a different kind of accounting. The woman who might be Maria noticed him first. Her hair was threaded with white like the wind had been combing it all morning. She kept her gaze level, offering a folded blue scarf to a man in a delivery jacket with the mechanical patience of someone used to being overlooked. Her laugh, when it came, was a small thing like the chime of coins. Jonathan stepped closer. Instinct, then carefulness, like someone approaching a fragile monument. The sound of the river was louder now, the squelch of wet cardboard underfoot, the muffled horn of a distant ferry. He heard his own name in a memory like an echo in a hollow room. The vendors of the block glanced up, indifferent or alarmed. He put a 10 in her hand, and when their fingers touched, he felt the familiar traction of history. She did not move, as if recognizing him. She only said, "Sir," and smiled in the manner of someone who had practiced politeness in hard places. A child of about 9 tugged her sleeve and said, "Mama, sell quick," in a voice like a dry leaf. A thought cut through him. If that is Maria, who are these girls? He watched the way the child mouthed a word and how the woman corrected her gently, the cadence of a mother teaching a lesson. He called Elena Ruiz that evening. Elena ran Sunrise Harbor, a neighborhood refuge that had become a gathering point for people the city had pushed to its edges. The smell of institutional coffee and the persistent hum of fluorescent lights filled the background of the call. Elena listened, long breaths between her sentences. Her voice had the warmth of someone who had spent years convincing battered systems to bend. And she said, "Bring her in, we will see." Jonathan drove across the city, and the glass towers receded into brick and graffiti and stoops where someone strummed a guitar. He felt an old anxiety rise, the one that came with returning to a place where he had once proposed ideals he never fully practiced. At the door of Sunrise Harbor, the air was crowded with voices and the scent of soap and boiling soup. Inside, Maria was there, sitting at a table threading yarn into gloves, a little set of motions that did not belong to someone who had been hidden away completely. When she looked up, the room cooled down with the certainty of recognition, but also the distance of 10 years standing between them. Backstory about Jonathan needed room. The truth of his life lay in stops and starts.
He had grown up in a small coastal town where his father taught a lesson about knots and neatness, and his mother taught him how to fold origami cranes out of grocery lists. He learned very young that the world could be made orderly by will and numbers. He went to business school on a scholarship, worked nights in a diner, and kept a notebook of names of people who owed him nothing and who he owed everything. He climbed through mergers and risks and found himself at 45 with a title and a calendar that other people read like scripture. He wanted control because chaos had once cost him a childhood home, and the last words of his father were about keeping things together. When Maria came into his life, she carried a temper and a tenderness that unsettled his tidy approach. She was an artist with hands
that remembered other kinds of economies. She challenged him about charities and quotas, and one heated night she handed him a sealed envelope with names and dates and asked him to listen. When he did, he all but closed the envelope with a decision that would save his company reputation and destroy their marriage. That choice has been a stone in his shoe since. This backstory shows the pattern of decisions and the soft center he tried to deny. Elena introduced him to a set of names. Marcus Lee, who ran neighborhood deliveries. Rosa Alvarez, who organized small donations to the shelter. Detective Omar Santos, who had a slow method and a long memory. And Tanya Brooks, the social worker who kept meticulous notes. Because this was an investigation, it grew into a network of testimonies and small mercies. They took statements, they shared soup, they opened drawers of memory that had been packed away. In one conversation at the shelter, Jonathan asked Maria about the scar at her temple, and she touched it without comment, and he realized some scars are cataloged by habit, while other wounds are kept private. The first questions were gentle, then sharper. Who had supported her? Who had files with their name on them? Who had a home? When she said she had been sentenced years ago on an accusation of fraud, his throat closed. He remembered headlines of the trial, a quick prosecution, and the way his name was used in society, pieces in passing. He had not known the details then. He had not wanted to know. The chain of custody of the past had been broken, and someone had written the margins differently. The encounter at the street corner was more than memory. It was an incident that produced evidence. A handbill with a number scrawled on the back, a matchbook with a restaurant stamp, and a small folded paper bird. Maria had kept for 10 years because it smelled faintly of lemon soap. She gave it to Jonathan at Sunrise Harbor and said quietly, "This is why I was taken." He told her he would look into it, and she shook her head with a smile that hid a latitude of pain. "I do not want your pity," she said. "I want the truth." The sound of coffee being poured was a punctuation to that sentence, and the scent of bleach in the hall reminded him of institutional life. A witness stepped forward, 2 block neighbors, a young man named Lewis, who said he had seen a car idling by the bakery on the night Maria was arrested. He wrote down a license number in rough handwriting, but said he was not sure because his hands were shaking. Dialogue in that room opened like a series of windows. One person spoke, then another. Jonathan asked why this was important, and Elena said, "Because sometimes the only thing people have is each other." There was a pause, and the shelter clock. The first small threads of an investigation were now visible in the light of a kitchen lamp. They followed leads that seemed run-of-the-mill, then became complicated. Jonathan visited a file room at the courthouse with Jacob Park, the attorney he had hired. A deliberate man with a chalk crack of a smile. Jacob leaned over stacks of yellowed paper and said, "We have to look at custody records at the time they were subpoenaed and see who signed for them." The clerk in the archive was a woman named Beatrice, who had worked there for 30 years. Her nails stained with ink and her breath smelling of peppermint. She produced an envelope that should not have been there. It had a stamp that matched an accountant named Samuel Hale, who had been associated with Jonathan's old partner. Samuel was dead now, but the paper trail bent towards someone who had motive to move money and silence people. Journalists had written about an accusation against Maria, but not about the missing invoices.
Someone named Richard Hale had steered the prosecution in ways that smelled of leverage and late-night deals. The more Jonathan and Jacob worked, the more they found small discrepancies. Bank transfers with odd memos, a ledger entry crossed out in a hand that did not match the original signature, and, under a layer of dust, a handwritten letter tucked in a drawer at a pawn shop. The letter was from Maria. She said, "Please look into this for the children," and the paper still had the imprint of where a tear had been wiped away. The shelter became a locus of characters who mattered. Rosa Alvarez arranged food drives and called the girls by nicknames. Marcus Lee fixed ramps and got court notices forwarded to the shelter. Elena Ruiz kept track of who had slept where and marked birthdays on a calendar she pinned to the wall with a chipped magnet. Tanya Brooks saved phone records and wrote notes with a fountain pen. Her presence was quiet but full of pressure. She arranged for Maria to meet with Dr. Leah Chen, a forensic specialist whose reputation for delicate lab work was only matched by her patience. Leah's lab smelled of antiseptic and warm tape and the low hum of centrifuges. She explained forensic processes slowly, how evidence is logged in a chain of custody, and how DNA testing is performed to avoid contamination. When Leah described how samples are sealed, double-wrapped, and logged with timestamps and signatures, the procedural detail made Jonathan feel both relieved and terrified. The chain of custody is a series of steps that start with collection and end with lab analysis. Each transfer is documented by time, place, and person, preventing tampering or confusion. It is the spine of credibility in any forensic inquiry. The moment Jonathan and Maria sat across from each other in a small visiting room at the city lockup was pitched.
Dialogue. Here, spread out and loaded with hesitations and actions. Jonathan touched the table and then did not touch it. He said, "Maria, do you remember the night they took you?" She looked at him, and there was a hardness in her face that was not anger, only reserve. She answered, "I remember a car that smelled of cigarette smoke, and a man with a suit who said he had papers. He mentioned your company," she added softly. That is when Jacob Park leaned forward, his hands on the table, and said, "Did you ever see Mr. Hale with documents relating to the ledger?" She looked at Jacob and then at Jonathan and said, "I never knew the names, only the faces. His names were masks to me." He paused, then asked, "Why did you leave?" He looked away and said, "I was afraid. It was easier to choose silence than to fight a machine." Her mouth went thin, and she said, "You and your silence cost me 10 years." They argued, then in a way that peeled the past back layer by layer. He said, "I did not know the full picture." She said, "You chose not to know." The words were sharp, and then apologetic. Comfort and accusation braided through the room like telephone wires. Backstory of the antagonist, Richard Hale, required depth. He had once been a colleague, a man with charm and appetite. He had grown up in a different neighborhood where hunger taught him to take opportunities ruthlessly. He became a fixer, the kind who smiled when ledgers balanced to his advantage. He had been kindly to Jonathan in early years, giving introductions and handshakes at dinners. He had also been a man who could fabricate signatures and move accounts when it served him. There were rumors of threats in his wake, and of small men being paid to look the other way. After Samuel's death, Richard had advantage. He had motive to bury awkward names. He cultivated relationships in the courthouse with a polished envelope and an affable laugh. He hid ambition behind a charitable check and a dinner invitation. There was a photograph of him at a ribbon cutting, shaking hands with a judge months before Maria's arrest. The back of the photo had a scribbled note that read, "Keep them quiet." He moved money through front companies and through charitable foundations, giving public gifts that obscured private transactions. He was the kind of antagonist who used kindness as camouflage, which made exposing him dangerous and necessary. They dug into bank records with a forensic accountant named Clara Nguyen, who sat cross-legged on the floor of Jonathan's study with hard copies spread like road maps. She had an eye for memos and an ability to read months like sentences. She found transfers that curved toward shell corporations and memos that matched the handwriting in the pawn shop letter. She traced a payment to a man named Victor Ames,
who had been seen leaving the courthouse the night of the arrest. Clara said the transfers were small on purpose to avoid detection, but there were too many of them in a pattern. She highlighted a line and said, "Look, now." At each point, the team documented with photos, timestamps, and signed affidavits. What Clara described next was a procedural one. The forensic accountant will obtain bank statements, obtain authorization for subpoenas. Those records are then compared line by line against reported income. Any discrepancy triggers a forensic review, which can reveal attempts to launder money through third parties. This process has a chain of custody of its own. Documents are printed, notarized, and logged. It establishes a link between the money and the person who orchestrated the movement. There were moments of tension that felt cinematic, yet painfully real. The first came when an anonymous envelope arrived at Jonathan's office containing a photograph of Maria in a courtroom and a post-it that said, "Watch your past." The second occurred during a night when someone slashed tires at Sunrise Harbor and left a dead rat on the step, a message of intimidation. The third was in the courtroom when a witness recanted suddenly and the entire case threatened to collapse. Each of these moments had a sensory nerve, small details that made them visceral. The envelope smelled faintly of printer toner and house cleaner. The rat was cold, damp, and left a metallic smell under the stairs. The courtroom recantation echoed like a hollow bell. The air felt thick with denial and the undercurrent sound of the ventilation system. The city lights outside the courthouse looked like indifferent stars. Each moment pulled the team into decisions whether to back away or push forward. There were whispered conferences in hallways, the scrape of chairs, the tap of shoes, and the quiet sighs of people leaning on one another. Because these were not only legal battles, but moral reckonings. They prepared for trial with Dr. Leah Chen, the forensic expert, explaining DNA testing to the court and to the public. The procedure is meticulous. Samples are collected with sterile swabs, are placed in sealed evidence bags, and logged with the time and the signature of the collector. The sample then goes to the lab, where technicians create extracts, amplify markers, and run controls to rule out contamination. Each run includes positive and negative controls, and every transfer between parties is logged to maintain chain of custody. The report is generated and then peer-reviewed before submission to ensure reproducibility and accuracy. All of this was explained in lay terms to the jury by Leah to reduce fear of the science and to emphasize the reliability of the process. The courtroom listened intently, and the sound of a pen clicking was a steady metronome. The court days were long, and the dialogues inside were dense. With Jacob Park leading the defense, Jonathan sat in the gallery and watched the performance of politicians. He saw Richard Hale in the front row, his smile calm and practiced. The prosecutor, Miss Angela Ross, read her testimony clearly. Her voice was steady and precise, and she presented bank records, witnesses, and the forensic report. Jonathan felt the room tilt at moments when a piece of evidence landed. The judge, Margaret O'Connor, asked pointed questions, and the gallery filled with the low hum of camera feeds. Jacob cross-examined with a mixture of strategy and compassion. He asked the witness about dates and signatures. He produced the pawnshop letter on the stand and watched a murmur pass through the courtroom. The witness, who had recanted before, came back under oath, and the explanation was suddenly credible. The ledger entries matched the handwriting analysis by Dr. Leah Chen, who confirmed the ink and pressure were inconsistent with Maria's known samples. There were dialogues of accusation and rebuttal, long stretches that demanded 8 to 10 exchanges between counsel, witnesses, and the judge. Scenes of this nature stretched into hours and were punctuated by recesses where people argued quietly in hallways and sipped tepid coffee. The climax came when a set of phone records surfaced, showing calls between an assistant to Richard Hale and an investigator associated with the old prosecution. The records had been recovered by Detective Omar Santos, who had worked small angles and big patients. He had plucked metadata from backups and matched a pattern. The judge allowed the new evidence in after a tense bench conference. That sequence was a charged moment of several paragraphs. The courtroom smelled of paper and the heat of a room full of expectation. The jury leaned forward slightly as the timeline was reconstructed. The prosecutor faltered, then adjusted her narrative. Jacob Park asked for a moment to approach the bench and then motioned for a recess. It was a physical release of breath in the theater of law. The verdict was a title shift that sounded like both an ending and a beginning. The jury returned, and the foreperson spoke the word "not guilty" in a hush that seemed to spread like sun after cloud. Tears came quietly from people who had long kept them folded inside. Their hugs were careful and tentative, as if not to break something still fragile. In the post-verdict room, Maria sat with her hands clasped. She heard the word guilty changed to vindicated, and her shoulders dropped, like someone who had been holding up a roof. The court awarded restoration of custody records and a possibility of a formal inquiry into the chain of command that had led to her conviction. The phrase "second chance" was used by a reporter in an article that night, and it lodged in both their minds as an odd, beautiful thing. After the verdict, the first meeting between Maria and her oldest daughter, Leela, was gentle. They met in a visitation room with a plastic plant on the sill and the smell of camphor.
Lemon cleaner that the facility used to announce cleanliness, Lila ran forward, and the two hugged with a kind of clumsy urgency that rewired Jonathan's understanding of what family could look like. He watched and felt both excluded and included at once. It was complicated. The DNA report came back positive, linking Maria to a child named Anna who had been in foster care. The document included chain of custody logs, photographs of samples, and Dr. Leah Chen's signature, which certified the procedures used. The legal result was clear. Custody was not restored automatically, but the path had opened for reunification processes. The judge commented on the need for rehabilitation and reintegration services to support that process, and ordered evaluations. They began to build practical steps toward reintegration, with social worker Tanya Brooks arranging transitional housing and a plan for job training. Elena arranged for Maria to teach a knitting workshop at the shelter, which doubled as therapy for the women and as a small income source. Jonathan worked with Clara and Jacob to set up a foundation in Maria's name, a fund that would help other people who had been wrongfully convicted. The foundation would focus on legal aid and job training and would fund emergency shelters like Sunrise Harbor. Jonathan sat across from Maria, planning the foundation, and felt the shape of his life shift. He said to her, "I do not know if this erases anything," and she answered, "It does not erase, but it gives space for other things." 1 month after the verdict, Maria had a small apartment provided through the Transitional Housing Program. She kept a mug with a chip in the rim and a plant on the sill that was slow to grow. The community showed up. The apartment was painted by volunteers from Jonathan's company, and Elena organized a roster for meals. The first month felt like learning to walk again. It included paperwork, meetings, and a briefing on how to avoid triggers. There was a small dinner at the shelter, where Jonathan served soup and Maria taught a small group to fold paper flowers.
She smiled in a way that seemed lighter, and the community began to stitch new patterns into her daily life. The lease was signed, and the first month was full of small domestic victories, like finding a broom and learning that sunlight comes at a different angle through different windows. 3 months later, the foundation had its first board meeting. Clara Nywen sat at the head of the table, and Jonathan filed the initial grant paperwork. The foundation approved funding for an expansion of Sunrise Harbor and a pilot program for legal clinics in low-income neighborhoods. The work was slow, bureaucratic, and deeply satisfying. Maria had regular therapy sessions and was meeting with a vocational coordinator. She had started teaching art classes at the shelter, and 3 of the women who had stood with her on the street were volunteers. Now, the community around them had shifted. Several people had expressed remorse publicly, and Richard Hale faced a separate civil inquiry that was gaining traction in the press. The court of public opinion had begun to reframe the story, and the charity network had mobilized donations that would sustain the shelter for months. 6 months after the verdict, the reintegration process showed tangible outcomes. Maria had secured part-time work at a community arts center, and the girls who had been under her care were enrolled in school programs. Jonathan had scaled back his travel and began attending morning meetings at the foundation. He planted a fundraiser that doubled as a community fair, and Sunrise Harbor had a new wing with a kitchen. Jonathan and Maria walked through the wing one afternoon, the smell of fresh paint and warm bread in the air, and they stopped by a window where children were painting. The scene felt provisional and hopeful, and the changes were not miraculous, but real. There were still legal questions pending. Charges against accomplices had not been fully resolved, but the rhythm of daily life had adjusted. They had built a small network of support and were learning to live within it. The court ordered an audit into the original prosecution that outlined procedural failures and the possibility of misconduct. The audit described issues with chain of custody, missing declarations, and questions about how evidence had been moved from one jurisdiction to another. The procedural description clarified the steps the review would take. An independent team would examine files, interview clerks, and cross-reference timestamps and bank records. Any deviations from standard protocol would be documented. The report was comprehensive and spurred a recommendation for an internal review at the prosecutor's office, which in turn led to hearings. The documents were dense, but their conclusion was stark enough to force changes in policy about evidence handling and oversight. There were losses along the way. Friends who had judged them could not return, and a reputation is not a garment to be easily mended. Yet there were new alliances. The community that had once only nodded now showed up in tangible ways. The foundation created a small fund for immediate legal support, and Sunrise Harbor reported a measurable increase in volunteers and donations. For Maria, the work of repair was daily and ordinary. She learned to shop for groceries again, to handle a heater that would not light, to read school notes, and to sit through PTA meetings, not as a ghost, but as a parent. If you were in Jonathan's place, would you have come back into a life you had left? The question is less theoretical when you watch people recover. It demands a reckoning about choices and responsibilities. We want to hear from you. If you were there at that street corner, would you have left money and walked away, or stopped and asked for a name? Tell us in the comments. Start your.
I would, so it is easier for others to follow. The reason we ask is because these conversations matter. They shape how communities respond to second chances, and your perspective could help someone else who reads these comments feel less alone. Share a memory, if you have one, of recognizing someone unexpectedly or of taking a step that changed a life. Your words help build a collective sense of what care looks like in practice. They also guide what stories we tell next and how we frame them. As you write, we will continue this story and show how a single encounter opened a path to justice and to rebuilding. In the end, the verdict changed legal records, but the real transformation was practical and human. Jonathan moved from distance to engagement. He restructured his days to include hours at the foundation and began to understand philanthropy as work, not display. Maria began to teach and to claim quiet pleasures like a warm cup of tea and a morning walk.
She learned to accept help and to refuse pity. She kept a small stack of paper flowers on her table as a reminder of the day the wind had given back a face. The city instituted training for clerks about chain of custody. Prosecutors updated evidence policies, and at Sunrise Harbor, a new wing hummed with activity. The judge offered a brief statement about the need for humility in institutions, and the public conversation shifted toward accountability. There are lessons here about the price of silence and the cost of choices. The legal system provided a forum, the forensic processes established truths, and the community created scaffolding for a life to return. But the most stubborn work was personal. How do you repair a life given the right to live it again? That question has no single answer. Yet, the story shows that honesty, repair, and sustained support can create space for reintegration. The team of people who believed in Maria were many and named. They included Elena Ruiz, Marcus Lee, Rosa Alvarez, Tanya Brooks, Jacob Park, Dr. Leah Chen, Clara Nguyen, Detective Omar Santos, Beatrice, the clerk, and Jacob's paralegal Naomi. Each of them acted in small ways that together became sufficient. If this story touched you, subscribe to follow the journey. We will bring more episodes about the people who find second chances and the systems that must change to make those chances possible. Your subscription helps us tell these stories with depth and care, and it allows us to fund the reporting that uncovers documents and pays experts to explain them. Thank you for listening and for being part of a community that believes in asking hard questions and in making room for repair. Sometimes the hardest route is the one that leads people back home.